Now, on to our presentation. Our presenters this morning come from two member companies, Agile One and TCDI. Tony Petricola is president of Agile One. Agile One's adaptive security framework and SOC as a service helps customers open visibility of digital assets, migrate cyber risk, keep customer data secure, and intellectual property safe. Agile One is a premier cybersecurity and cyber engineering advisory prepared to battle the next generation of cyber threats and risks. Our second speaker is Tim Opsitnik. He's the Executive Vice President and General Counsel of Technology Concepts and Design, Inc., or TCDI. Tim is at the forefront of practitioners addressing issues involved in the security and discovery of electronically stored information. TCDI consults with corporations and law firms to provide litigation management software, electronic discovery, computer forensics, and cybersecurity services. We have a brief agenda this morning during our hour-long webinar. We'll be going over these 6 main cybersecurity topics, including general cybersecurity concerns, why manufacturers in particular are targeted, what are the threats, an overview of the Ohio Data Protection Act, then the frameworks and regulatory schemes, and finally, cybersecurity tips. We thought we'd begin with a quick poll, find out how prolific the problem is with our audience here. So please take a moment and look at your screen. You should have a poll asking if you know anybody who has been the victim of a cybersecurity incident. Give this a few seconds for people to get their answers in. All right, it looks like we have 89% of the respondents do know somebody who has been the victim of a cybersecurity incident. So with that, I'll pass it on to our presenters.
So this first slide is just a reminder of everything that we've seen recently in the media, all the different data incidents, and I think almost every one of us have been affected in some way or another, and we've gotten letters in the mail telling us about many of these. But what's important to note is for every one of these, there's 1,000 that don't hit the media, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Those other 1,000, which are far more occurring than most people appreciate.
Tony?
Yep, thanks, Tim. And this is Tony Petricola. So just to get started, let's talk about the threat. And obviously with 89% saying either them or someone they know, it's obviously top of mind. But let's talk about small to mid-sized manufacturers. You have some stats on screen that really go a long way, not just with the FBI showing a surge in cyber attacks, especially with small and mid-sized manufacturers. Just look recently, and I know these aren't manufacturers, but the Cleveland Airport and St. Ambrose School. I mean, St. Ambrose had a little over $1.75 million stolen. Those are enormous numbers. In fact, there was another statistic that said small and mid-sized manufacturers between 6 and 12 months after being hacked or face a ransomware literally could go out of business because it's just a big number, and it could be a number that insurance may not cover. But just a couple other points. As of 2018, so the beginning of 2018, so the data is about a year old, maybe a year and a half, manufacturing remained the second biggest target for hackers, which is interesting when you put together financial services and healthcare and some of the other, some of the other industries. But a question that I'm sure you guys are throwing out is why? Why would small and mid-sized manufacturers continue to be heavily hacked, aside from probably having smaller budgets than some of the bigger guys in some of the industries? Well, think about it. Intellectual property is a big deal. Number two, disruption of your ops, assembly, different things like that is more malicious, but it could definitely have an impact on how you're able to produce and interface with your customers. There's obviously lots of trade secrets and lots of data that could be stolen and breached as well. So when you put it all together, small and mid-sized manufacturers, because of a perception of lower IT budgets and less defense, have a lot of rich data that folks tend to go for.
Yeah, I would just summarize by saying our manufacturing clients who are small tend to be less sophisticated than others, and for that reason, they are uniquely vulnerable. We can move on to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the impact of cybersecurity incidents. Why do we care about cybersecurity? Tony mentioned the loss of intellectual property, and goes without saying that you know, if you lose your best kept secrets, it's tough to do business, and we've all heard about how state actors such as China and others are constantly on the prowl to take intellectual property. In addition to that, we've got direct financial loss, and Tony mentioned the St. Ambrose incident, and we'll talk a little bit later about what we refer to as the business email compromise, which is an effort by someone to trick you into transferring your money to somebody other than who you intended it to go to. Then we have unfavorable media exposure or damage to reputation. This is something you can't measure. I mean, there are companies, because of these things, you know, publicly traded companies who will lose billions of dollars in a day of market cap because of their damage to their reputation. Outages and disruption of business. You know, this is your ability to keep your business running. And we're going to talk a little bit later about ransomware and how this directly affects your ability to run your business. Regulatory audits and fines. This is, you know, our government enforcing things upon us that, or, you know, auditing us and fining us for things that we should have done. You know, 6-8 years ago, they only came looking where there was a known problem, but today they're engaged in random audits and other things. So this has really picked up a pace. You know, civil lawsuits, and although the class action lawsuits, which we are very familiar with, haven't had much steam here, and the individual lawsuits are not very large, and so there hasn't been much motivation to file them. More recently, there's a number of states, principally California, who've introduced legislation that will allow for private rights of action under their regulatory framework. And so the thought is that the lawsuits will most likely increase markedly, especially in California. Then, of course, we have the concerns of criminal charges for those that really do such a poor job at this, that their information is stolen, or third parties with whom they've protected information has been stolen. The next slide, if you would, please. So, in addition to those reasons why I do this, and I like to think about this more positively, and the first is competitiveness. And look, one way that you can differentiate yourself from your competitors is to do some things better than others. And right now, I will tell you, few organizations are doing a very effective job at cybersecurity. So it's a good opportunity to be competitive. Contractual obligations, and this is one that's very important, and we'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about the individual frameworks. And this is a particular misstep that I see in the manufacturing realm, and that is that we blindly sign agreements with our suppliers or with companies with whom we're doing business, providing our what we manufacture and their components, and we don't realize the contractual obligations that we've put ourselves in because of the agreements that we sign. And this is something we have to be very careful about today, because this is a misstep that I've seen, and I've seen manufacturing businesses become almost completely idle because their largest company that they do business with has told them you must meet these obligations. You signed this form, this contract saying you were going to do these things and you haven't done them. And lastly, one reason to do this is because of the Ohio Data Protection Act, for those of you who are located or do business in the state of Ohio, which provides us a safe harbor for those who have, carried out responsible or become reasonably compliant with certain cybersecurity frameworks. Tony, I know I went through a lot here in the last two slides, but anything in addition that you have to add, please.
Yeah, just a few points, and I think this is important. States have started to pass cybersecurity bills inclusive of their states. Obviously, Tim's going to talk about the Ohio Data Protection Act. Other states like New York, California, of course, Michigan, Kansas have passed laws. Recently, Washington State passed a law like a few weeks ago. The interesting thing is when you look at having a single point of federal legislation that helps provide a guide, it's a lot more helpful, especially for small and mid-sized businesses, because you don't have troves of lawyers and compliance folks making sure everything is in line. When you might be in the state of Ohio but might do business everywhere, like business is today, it's not just a local thing for the majority of us. There's different laws and different rules that need to be interpreted. So it's interesting as you start branching out into different states to understand where some of these liabilities, where some of these protections, and obviously some states that don't have anything. It's interesting to understand when you're doing business in these states what they have or don't have, because some of it really makes sure that if there is a breach, that if there is a hack or whatever it might be, that you're following some of the guidelines that they've laid out. So it's something to be mindful of, especially as you start branching out from Ohio. I think our next slide, and Tim's going to lead it off, is going to talk about Ohio, or we're going to do a survey first, and we can kind of dive a little bit deeper. But some of these standards do start applying across different states. It would just be nice if there were a little less frameworks, 50 frameworks, and maybe start bringing that down to some more federal stuff. But I'll go ahead and allow the survey to be asked.
So our next question is about when there is a threat, what you do about it. And so the question is, do you have a written response plan for cybersecurity incidents? All right, here we go. Looks like we've got about half of the folks do not have a plan, or 44% do already have a plan.
So let's talk a little bit about that last question, and I know we're going to talk more later when we get into our cybersecurity tips, but we brought up the incident response plan, and let me tell you why that's so important. Tony mentioned the regulatory compliance requirements that are out there, and separate from that are the frameworks, the cybersecurity related or compliance frameworks that we must be on track to comply with. And they all require an incident response plan and in writing. And why is that so important? Because often the companies that come to investigate a cyber incident, and when they start the investigation, what they're investigating you for is more about what you did after the investigation. It's about how you handled yourself. It's about how you notified the people who were affected. And did you notify everyone? And how quickly did you notify them? And what steps did you take to remediate the problem? So you are often judged more about your actions after the breach than before the breach, because those sorts of things are easier for the regulatory bodies that do these investigations to judge you on. So having a written incident response plan and being prepared to execute it is so important. You don't want to be developing it during the middle of a crisis. Nobody acts well during the crisis. And so it's very helpful to have those written plans.
Yeah, and following up on this slide, we kind of talked a little bit about some of these major points a few minutes ago, so we won't labor over them. But I think some folks who are on this webinar can probably understand this. I just came from a cybersecurity conference last week. It was a little bit larger companies, but it doesn't matter because they're all seeing the same thing. And just because you're larger, doesn't necessarily mean you have more percentage of your IT budget going to cybersecurity, and you might have more data, but it doesn't matter that you still have data and data that can be breached. So we talked about sufficient security measures and training personnel. I think that's something that a lot of folks tend to see. But just understanding the vulnerabilities of your organization, especially as more things move to the cloud. I think a lot of folks just think this cloud is this beautiful, magical place where nothing can go wrong, and it's all on Jeff Bezos and Amazon's shoulders to figure it out. Nothing could be further from the truth, as our networks tend to decentralize, and we tend to do more things using applications and cell phones and the cloud and cloud-based applications. Even using newer technologies such as RPA, robotics process, and IoT. I don't think a lot of folks on this call are into IoT, but IoT obviously is a very a large and growing piece of the manufacturing world. These new technologies, all of them that I just mentioned, bring in newer challenges. Number one, there's a lot larger attack surface that can be exploited. Number two, you don't necessarily have 100% control out of all these things. And number three, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this when we talk about supply chain, some of the more trusted applications and trusted processes that you've used for many years, those are the things being exploited, because if you've trusted them for 5 years or 2 years or whatever it might be, you tend to let the guard down a little bit and think, oh, well, this has got to be secure. Believe it or not, those are some of the ways that these hackers are exploiting things. It's some of the older trusted methodologies that we use. So that's why manufacturers are rich targets. And think about it. Not only do you have a lot of data, you got a lot of IP, you got a lot of trust between other manufacturers and your supply chain and customers. So once you get in a hacker's purview is once you get into something, it could really expound. 2 becomes 4, 4 begets 8, so on and so forth. And it really becomes a big jumping off point. Tim, if you don't have anything to add, we can move on to the next slide.
So this slide is going to get down into a little bit of the grass here, and we'll go through this somewhat quickly, and I'll point out what I think you really need to know here. We worried a lot about things like viruses and worms before, and much of these are different types of malware. You've heard these words before: Trojans and bots and keyloggers and spyware and adware. 15 years ago, all we worried about were spyware and adware, and that's people watching you and trying to figure out what your habits are and how to market to you and things like that. Today, they're not necessarily we're not necessarily as concerned to them, except to the extent they're trying to steal passwords and things like this. But what I think you really want to focus on this slide, and we'll talk a little bit on the next slide too, are ransomware and the business email compromise. So let's talk a little bit about ransomware. In ransomware, what it basically is, it's a malware that you get either because somebody received an email and they typically execute some malware onto their system, onto your system, that gives a backdoor and allows other malware to be added. And this goes out and it encrypts and locks up your valuable information. And then you get a message that says, you've got 96 hours to pay me X number of Bitcoin. And if you don't pay those Bitcoin, then, your data is forever locked. So hopefully you've got, adequate backups and it's not an issue. But for some people, that's not the case, or they can't necessarily recover within the time period allotted by the message. And so they're trying to struggle. Do I pay the ransom? Do I try to recover my systems? And, we see 3 to 5 cases of ransomware a week that we respond to from incidents. And one of the reasons why I point this out is because the incidence of ransomware is up over several thousand% this year over last year. And not only is the incidence of it up, but the ransom is up. You know, 3 or 4 years ago, the typical ransom that we would see was in the $1,000 to $3,000 to $5,000 range. You know, 2 years ago or last year, the ransoms that we'd see were in the $10,000 to $20,000 range. Now this year, believe it or not, the typical ransoms that we see are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so this has become a real issue that companies need to address. And later on, we'll talk about the sorts of things you need to do to prevent ransomware, but I just can't emphasize enough how critical it is to protect your systems against ransomware.
Yeah, and just to add one point to that, because it's relevant and in the news, and I think when things are in the news, it makes sense. I mean, look at the city of Baltimore with this ransomware issue they have going on. These hackers have taken the city of Baltimore's data and held it ransom, and Baltimore is basically still hobbled. The city's not operating you know, as efficient as they can. As a Cleveland Browns fan, I like to think Baltimore never operates correctly, but they're not operating, and they're playing hardball. They are not giving in to the ransom, and we'll have to see how things end up playing out. But as you open the Wall Street Journal this morning, or CNBC, or wherever you go to get news, you'll see this is top of mind. Totally understand this is not a manufacturer, but it's just another thing, like Tim said. There's high-profile things you see every day, and there's 1,000 things behind the scenes that you don't see. Because obviously, if it's going to work at the city of Baltimore, it's definitely going to work at a 30-person manufacturer in Cleveland, Ohio.
And why is this such a problem? The barrier to entry is so minimal. You can buy a kit to execute ransomware for as little as $29 on the dark web. And so there are lots of people doing this. It's not just nation states threats, but young people trying to make a buck elsewhere. So it really is a prolific problem. If we could go on to the next slide, and I want to talk about the next slide. If you learn nothing today, please, if you receive an email that says my account that you wire my money to has changed, please now send it to this account. Pick up the phone and call them and confirm it. I cannot tell you how bad this business email compromise is today. Tony started out by talking about St. Ambrose here in Cleveland, and they were tricked to wiring their money to a contractor who was making an addition on the local school or the church to another account. You know, typically, if you notify the FBI within 24 hours, they can get your money back. Anywhere from 24 to 40 hours, they can get some of it back. But pretty much after 48 hours, the money is lost. And so what happens in a business email compromise is somehow, again, through some phishing effort or otherwise, some member of the company email is compromised, and they begin to watch that email. They typically sync to that email, and they watch the email, and they look for an opportunity, such as the executive, the CEO, and I'm not making this up, this is a true story. The CEO of a company is traveling to China, and they now look at this as an opportunity. And when the CEO's in China, they send a message pretending to be the CEO to the CFO saying, I found a company that I'd like to purchase, and I need to make a down payment. Please wire $1.5 million to the following address. And companies, the CFO, without hesitation, he follows the instructions of the CEO. He doesn't pick up the phone or doesn't do anything, and he wires the money and to the address. And of course, it was all a charade, and the money is now lost. And this business email compromise, these tricks that are done to force you to pay someone over somebody else are up thousands of %. And so please be careful. Make sure your employees have a process in writing that basically says that when your clients change how they're receiving money, or that if they institute wire transfer or something of that like, that you are going to confirm all that information with them either personally or over the telephone.
And it happens internally as well. About 6 months ago, to a manufacturing company here in Cleveland that will remain nameless. Internally, the director of HR, again, small company, I think about 30 or so folks, the manager of HR received an email from the vice president saying, I have a new checking account. I need you to change my direct deposit. I was unable to log into our HR system, whatever HR system they used. And, a vice president sends the HR person a note. That person was traveling, like Tim said, and I'll come back to the traveling thing here in a second. And she took it for what it was worth, didn't follow up because he wasn't in the office, which happened to be 2 doors down from her, and made the change. And his salary, that weekly pay, was wired to a malicious actor. And when he didn't get his check, he's like, hey, I didn't get my check this week. And she said, yeah. Every week we made the change of your account. You should have everything. And he said, what change? So not only does it happen externally, it can happen internally, and there's behaviors. One example I'll give you personally, I ran a financial services firm here in town for a number of years. And when people closed on their homes, that was an event where these emails would get triggered, because that's when money's moving. People are expecting an email to maybe take place, and it just kind of gets into your conscience that you need to act on that email. Well, internally around maybe payroll time and different things, you'll see some of this during healthcare when you're making your electives during healthcare, so maybe Q3, Q4-ish. These business compromise emails tend to get big, and these folks are smart. They do know when people are traveling. They do understand routines, and they definitely understand big events. So be skeptical. It doesn't mean you got to run around to your office and knock on everybody's door asking if that email is correct, but you just need to be skeptical of the things that can seem harmful. All right, let's talk a little bit about supply chain attacks. And I would have to assume everybody on this call uses supply chains or a part of supply chains. And what's interesting about this is I talked a few minutes ago about relevant news. Last week in Wired Magazine, and if you just go to the Wired Magazine and type in supply chain cyber attack, you'll see the article. You can also go to my LinkedIn and you'll see I have a link at the article for you guys this morning. There was an article written specifically on this. And I talked a little bit earlier about trust attacks. Well, supply chain attacks are increasing tremendously. And the reason for it is obviously a distribution of business. More supply chains are coming together because of technology. And when you look at how supply chains can be exploited, it might not be you, right? You might have your stuff very well secure and a lot of your vulnerabilities taken care of. And maybe you're even using security to manage your networks. But it might be someone below you or above you in the supply chain that does have that vulnerability that brings in that malware to create these supply chain attacks. I mean, obviously, attackers can focus on valid credentials. I mean, that's a big thing. But you're seeing more and more of them exploiting historically trusted applications. And in the 2 instances you can read about in Wired, I believe the attack is called barium. I think you'll read about this if you go to the article. But if you're a manufacturer, you should definitely read the article. And Wired, even though their stories tend to be long, they do a really nice job of kind of laying out how a couple of well-known, well-used applications that have been in the industry for a very long time had been compromised. And just like anything else, the malware was sitting there. It doesn't mean it's going to act today or tomorrow. It may act a year from now. It might just be sitting there and looking for the right time to act. But this barium was on these traditional supply chain applications. And instead of destruction, instead of just taking data and closing things down or requesting money, it was simply spying. It was spying. It was spying to see what IP could be collected, whether types of trade secrets, deals could be collected. Here's an important thing: pricing and costs. Sometimes we think about financials and we think about those types of things, or we think about pay, people's pay. You'll see a lot of attacks on, hey, how much do people in my company make? But I think one of the biggest ones you're starting to see is cost. In a supply chain, if we can see costs, manufacturing costs, think about it, that data got out. That could really upend not only deals you've put together, it could potentially sour relationships up and down the supply chain, maybe even with customers, right? And when you look at some of this spying, instead of trying to do destruction or ask for money right away, they're just collecting this data. And that's a sign that it's not just about the data or the IP. It could be about the specific things that equal cost, which is everything to someone's business. So also when you think about the supply chain, lots of small and mid-sized manufacturers tend to use hardware that is cheaper. It's definitely a little bit more complex, meaning lots of configuration options and things like that tend to get overlooked during setup. And they tend to be reused. And you put those three things together, and we really can't open up the supply chain to attacks, whether it's directly to you or somewhere up and down the supply chain where they're able to exploit those things. Tim, please feel free to join in and talk about anything on the supply chain side.
No, I think that's great. It's the only thing I would add is that this helps to explain why many of your suppliers and those your clients and others are asking you to sign agreements that say you must do X, Y, or Z, or follow a particular framework. They're very concerned about these vulnerabilities. What tends to happen is with these products, are they were developed with a backdoor in mind for developers, and somewhere along the line, the people who do the hacking find out about it, and they are able to take advantage of the vulnerabilities. We can go on to the next slide. The thing to note about this particular slide is that the phishing continues to be a problem and affects small and medium-sized organizations. Everybody thinks it's just the large organizations, but as we'll talk about later, when we give our tips and we talk a little bit more about training, we can't emphasize enough the importance of training staff to avoid phishing. I think next we have do we have a poll next? Yeah, I think we do.
We have a poll next, yes. So this one goes into what companies are doing in order to be aware of the active monitoring. Does your company use an active monitoring cybersecurity program to protect your business? Another second, since we're running a little short on time. All right, it looks like we are doing very well, that we have 88% of our participants do active monitoring now.
That's terrific, and I think we'll talk later in our cybersecurity tips about active monitoring and what that means to a company. I suspect most people are responding to this thinking about virus protection, but there are lots of other types of active monitoring, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. The purpose for this slide really is to help everybody to understand that, where are we and where do we want to be? Too often organizations have a hard time understanding where they are in terms of their cybersecurity. Are they ad hoc? Are they just reactive and responding to things as they happen? Or are they leading? Has everything integrated in their strategies and changes into how they do things? Most people seem to fall in the developing stage to practicing. And most manufacturers, it's unlikely you're in the leading stage unless you're in the critical defense structure or some other aspect of doing business with the government where they're going to require it. But what I think is very important about this is to not be two ships passing in the night when you're working with others within the company or outside the company. Know where you are and know where you want to be. Come to an understanding where, look, we don't have to be leading. The Volkswagen is just fine for us. We don't need the Cadillac of services. And this is a way of talking about where we are and how to get on the same page.
Just one point to to bring up, and I totally agree. I totally agree. You don't need to be on that bleeding edge, because I think as we see, a lot of the bleeding edge stuff still has a lot of stuff to work out. But where small and mid-sized manufacturers, I think, can take advantage is to think offensively a little bit instead of just totally defensively. I think when you look at cybersecurity solutions that are meant for the small to mid-sized level of any industry, but obviously we're talking about manufacturing today, they're very defensive type products, which is fine. And you have to have those things. But there are offensive type of products, and there's an offensive mindset that says if we're looking for things, if we're actually hunting for things to keep it away from our network, our cloud, our most valuable data, there is a less likelihood of having a breach. And it's that type of mindset that I think has to change a little bit. And if you look at some of the venture capital stuff that's coming, and it's always a great place to look, right? Look where the money is. It's starting to invest more and more in offensive strategies, both products and services. So it's something to keep in mind. When you're allocating IT budget, and that budget's going towards cyber, is it strictly going to defensive products? Or are there offensive products I can look at as well that might keep me a little bit more safe? And we can move on to the next slide.
So let's talk a little bit about the Ohio Data Protection Act, because that does make us unique in the state of Ohio. And we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about this because it's perhaps a little more complicated than we need to for this presentation. But in essence, what it does is it provides an affirmative defense to an action in tort where there is a cybersecurity data breach. That is, if somebody sues you, you have the ability to plead as part of your answer an affirmative defense to say, hey, I did a good job with my cybersecurity. I followed this framework and I can prove it. And, this is an aberration that happened, and I shouldn't be punished for an aberration because this is a tough world we live in right now. And so the Ohio Data Protection Act was developed by Cyber Ohio, and I'm on the board for Cyber Ohio, and it was the Attorney General's idea to Mike DeWine and now our governor to create Cyber Ohio, and he wanted to develop something which was not punitive, but it was more of a carrot rather than a stick approach to cybersecurity, something to make Ohio unique, to say, hey, we're still open for business in Ohio, and we want you to come here and do business in Ohio. And so it was very important that it created this incentive for business, and not to create a minimum standard or a private right of action in any respect, but to allow businesses to improve their cybersecurity hygiene and be rewarded for it. And it has a proportional aspect to it as well that looks at the size of the organization and the type of data they have and things of that nature. And why don't we go on to the next slide? And one of the ways that you can show that you reasonably conform to this cybersecurity that allows you this affirmative defense is that you say that you followed a particular type of framework or regulatory scheme. And I'm not going to go into much detail about these particular regulatory schemes or these frameworks, except for a few which are perhaps more manufacturing related than others. And, I want to make note of those because companies often ask me, what should I be doing and who should I be following? Where can I look and what's easy to do? But these particular frameworks can be very, very complex. And so the first framework to note, which is NIST 800-171. These are organizations that are doing business with the government. The government basically says this is a framework that you must follow, and it tends to be more of a subset of security controls in the normal NIST 800-53 framework. And, I apologize for the acronyms. And, for those who don't know, NIST is, the National Institute of Standards. This is their job to come up with things. And the NIST cybersecurity framework was developed as part of a presidential executive order under President Obama. But 800-171 is something which is required for manufacturers who are suppliers to the federal government, and manufacturers ought to be aware of this. We see these contractual requirements, and you should be aware of these, and this is, this will help you to comply with the Data Protection Act. Another one that you will often see as manufacturers is ISO 27000. And for those of you who are implementing or otherwise involved in ISO, the International Standards Organization for manufacturing, you're probably familiar with this. And 27000 is very particular to the cybersecurity framework. And many manufacturers are familiar with ISO, and it's very involved to do this, but yet it's something that we're quite familiar with as manufacturers. Now, I often get asked the question, okay, I don't want to go through the ISO 27000, and I'm not doing business with the government, so 800-171 doesn't apply to me, and what can I do, and what of these frameworks is something that I can follow? And the CIS controls, the computer internet security controls, is much more prescriptive than the other frameworks. It tends to be have identified lists of security controls where you can go through and evaluate yourself and check off the box, where many of the other things like NIST and ISO 27000, they more take you on a journey of evaluation and analytical tests to go through and see what your requirements are. So if you're looking to comply with the Ohio Data Protection Act and you're a manufacturer, the Center for Internet Security Controls prescription tend to be very helpful. What I want to caution people about, and I mentioned this when I was talking about the contractual element of this, is we sometimes find that we obligate ourselves to certain of these frameworks without realizing it. So, on HIPAA and high-tech, for example, which are ways that you can comply with the Ohio Data Protection Act, these are healthcare related. And what we often see is our manufacturers who happen to sign agreements as being just went blank on the term, on a business, wow, I'm sorry, I went blank on it, but you are you're doing business with a healthcare provider, a business associate, So if you're a business associate under HIPAA or high-tech, then you sign an agreement that says you're going to comply with the security controls of HIPAA or high-tech. And so, I caution you on that regard to be careful about those. We can probably move on to the next slide.
All right, our final survey today has to do with training of our employees on an ongoing basis. So the question is, does your employer conduct onboarding and additional periodic training on cybersecurity awareness? With each response, it gets worse. I'm sorry. All right, we have 67% do not do onboarding and additional periodic training.
That's not uncommon. In fact, I think the number one thing you'll see CIOs of larger organizations and even CISOs of larger organizations say the biggest weak spot is employees. It may not be network or cloud or applications. it's most likely employees because of the things we talked about today, especially on phishing and emails and credentials and all kinds of things. I think that's pretty typical. As you get into small and mid-sized businesses, it becomes an even bigger blind spot for folks. And we're going to, end outside of questions. We're going to end on ways to mitigate and reduce cyber risk. And obviously, training is one of those things. But it's interesting to see the statistics. They generally are in those areas nationwide, industry by industry. It's just still a very large blind spot for folks is your own employees.
Yeah, let me expand on that a little bit. Let me explain that. Our clients often come to us and say, "I'm worried that I'm going to be hacked by the North Koreans or the Chinese or the Russians." And my response to them often is, "Well, if the North Koreans or the Russians or the Chinese decide to hack your company, they're going to get in, and you don't have any control over them." But I will tell you that the greatest concern and the best bang for your buck are those that you have control over. And you do have control over your employees. So periodic cybersecurity training and onboarding of new employees is your best bang for your buck and will make the biggest difference in what you can do to improve your cybersecurity hygiene. Second to that is third parties with whom you do business. You do have control over third parties with whom you do business, companies that you exchange and share information and data with. You can require them to do things, and you can make a big difference. In the healthcare space, 53% of all cybersecurity breaches are as a result of third parties with whom others are doing business. So I would encourage you to get involved in training, and not just for yourself, but even third parties if they're less sophisticated than you. So I know we've talked about training, which is number 4. We talked about incident response plan, which is number 1 on this list. Why don't I not talk for a minute? Tony, why don't you talk about one, and then we can go through these and tick them off.
Yeah, sounds good. So, I think understanding our vulnerabilities is always a big deal, right? And, you look at some companies and they have mandates of how often they need to understand that, but just performing vulnerability and penetration tests, at least annually, gives you a really good understanding of where you need to tighten things up. And it could be as simple as some of the things you see on block number 3. Applications need to be updated, operating systems. Now, with the advent of the cloud and more applications in the cloud, it's more configurations that need to be adjusted because there's like a billion of them, whether you're at AWS, which is Amazon, or Microsoft's Azure. Lots of configurations can leave you open. But those simple vulnerability and penetration tests, literally every company there should do them at least annually. And it gives you a good understanding of where you have some vulnerabilities. It might even scare you a little bit, which is good because then it'll put an action plan into place. And as part of those, before I let Tim go on with the next one, looking at your policies and procedures, that incident response plan that we talked about a few polls earlier, looking at those policies once a year as well makes a lot of difference, and make sure things are up to date. And you can obviously tie that into employee training and employee awareness. Go ahead, Tim.
So it's important to note that when we were talking about vulnerability scanning and penetration testing, what you do is often proportional to the size of the organization and the type of data that you have. Whereas for some company, annual may be sufficient. For other companies, it may be a requirement of either a particular framework or a regulatory scheme that you do it more often than that. It could even be quarterly. It could even be monthly. But annually for a small to mid-sized manufacturer for vulnerability or for penetration testing tends to make sense, although scanning could probably be quarterly. And those are consistent with what the requirements that we tend to see coming out of California and New York today. I'm going to talk about number 9, which is more compliance oriented, and that's understand necessary compliance and regulatory requirements applicable to the business. So that is, you need to take a look at the data that you have, And what are your obligations for that data? And also your contractual obligations. What do your contracts say? So you need to have an appreciation for understanding what your cybersecurity obligations are. And, that's what this is intending to address.
And I'm going to put 5 and 6 together to keep us moving. And, we talked about active monitoring. I think it was a poll where a lot of folks were doing it. And like Tim suggested, is that actually active monitoring or just your antivirus? But understanding all of your digital assets, understanding all your data and where it is obviously critical. Okay, that's the obvious part. But maybe you'd be shocked to understand the low percentage of companies who truly have a grasp of where all their data is. And again, it's that data more often than not, maybe outside of ransomware, that these cyber criminals are looking for, because that data is rich. It's got a lot of good stuff in there. So understanding, and by doing an audit on your data, understanding where it's at. If everything's on one server or if everything is in a certain area, obviously that's a part we want to pay a lot of attention to when trying to secure these things. But when you're monitoring, instead of just monitoring everything and you'd have no clue where things are, it makes sense to understand where all your digital assets are, and then you can put a real nice cybersecurity plan around how your most valuable assets are protected.
Yeah, so if there's an incident and the investigators come into your company, they're going to look at 3 things. And the first thing they're going to look at is, do you have an incident response plan and did you follow it? The second thing they're going to look at, because it's easy, do you train your employees on cybersecurity events? But the third thing they're going to look at is, do you understand the type of data you have? And, more to Tony's point, you really need to do a data audit, and you need to understand the type of data you have, because from their perspective, and I've had to deal with companies with the regulators many times, if you don't understand the data you have and where it's located, then you don't have a chance in hell to protect it. And that's their perspective. So it is essential to understand what data you have and how to protect it. So I'll jump to 10, which is conduct a cybersecurity assessment. And all this really is having some sort of third-party look, and it may even at its most extreme being some sort of third-party attestation for a gap analysis. They look at everything from your processes, your contracts, your documents. They evaluate all your cybersecurity controls, and they tell you where your gaps are, and then they assess those gaps on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of the degree of risk, and 1 to 10 on the cost to remediate. There are a number of organizations out there doing this. I would say that they're not all created equal, but having some sort of third-party cybersecurity assessment is an essential part of finding it out. And that is a requirement in almost every particular regulatory scheme or security framework to have a third-party audit.
So hopefully, I think we touched on all 10 of these just about. So hopefully these are things that portions you're doing, portions that maybe we alerted you to, but definitely things that it doesn't matter how big your organization is or what your budget is. These are all things that can be done. And when it comes to budgeting your IT budget, it's interesting. Of course, everybody always says IT budgets are rising and the cyber within IT budgets are rising. Think about it like this. Think about allocating money specific to cyber, because it's not just IT. Cyber affects business process, affects your partners, affects your customers. It actually spans multiple areas. So maybe cyber should have its own budget, but it also needs to create an efficiency. You can't just spend money to spend money, especially as a small business owner. You can't just do that. It doesn't work. So it needs to create those efficiencies and the security that gives you some peace of mind. Funny, the last thing I'll end with outside of questions, great article this morning with the Delta CEO of the Delta Airlines. He said, look, cybersecurity doesn't keep me up at night, but as the CEO, it's a top 3 thing that I work on personally. So maybe one piece is, it doesn't matter how big your business is, as a CEO or an executive at your company, it should be more mindful. And it should be something that you definitely just don't dot the I's and cross the T's, but something you actively have a plan to make sure that you're protecting your business.
And in fact, I'll add to that. And if you ask the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the U.S. Armed Services, what are the top 5 risks facing the United States, and listing up there with a nuclear attack is cybersecurity. So it is top of mind for everybody, and it should be for your organization as well.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. That was a very informative, information-packed hour. I guess we can now officially answer the question, are we vulnerable to a cybersecurity attack, with the answer of yes. And you have given us several practical things that even small manufacturers can do to combat that. I don't have any questions that have been submitted online, but I guess I might ask both you, Tony and Tim. So small manufacturers typically have small budgets. You know, if you just had 1 or 2 things that you could afford to do, what would be the first thing a small manufacturer could do in the fight against cybersecurity attacks?
Well, this is Tim. I'll start by saying, you know, look, we gave you a list of 10. And the first thing you should do is just start and do something. Don't stick your head in the sand and not do anything. Pick up the phone and figure it out. But I think I would start with training. And there's some very inexpensive internet-based training. You don't necessarily need elaborate training. There's some very inexpensive internet-based training that can be utilized. But I'd have to say training would be the place to start.
Yep.
Totally agree on the training. And if I had to choose a number 2, it would be understanding my vulnerabilities with my network, where my data is. And I think those penetration tests can only help an organization truly understand where they have their most vulnerabilities. So that'd be the second thing I would make sure I did as a business owner.
That's great. Thinking about the recent news, we've heard several examples, but if you think about the breach stories, can you give an example of a breach that taught a lesson that you think we should all learn from?
I'll just say there was an organization locally. I think there's actually a couple examples of this locally, not just one, unfortunately, where folks were keeping really interesting data within a very large software manufacturer's application. So again, there's that, hey, these guys are big and they're huge, and that's obviously got to be secure. But like we said, all things potentially can be compromised. So the point to understanding that is you got to make sure your applications are up to date, because even if you're using Microsoft everything, which I am, even though I use a Mac, I'm still using Microsoft applications. Even Microsoft applications, the biggest of the big, can be affected. So make sure things are up to date, they're patched, and you're using the applications the way that they should be used.
Yeah, and I would just add, lastly, that you need to ask. You need to ask your third parties, and you need to ask people within your company who you're entrusting are doing these things. Are they actually doing them? And what are they doing about them? Right after you get off this webinar, you pick up the phone, and if you have an outside IT provider or an inside IT person, you ask them, what are we doing about this, and how are we preventing it, and what should we be doing? And listen to what they have to say.
That's great. All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We will see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.